I would love to welcome back Jerry to our adult ed at Temple Sinai. I think most of you were here when he did that wonderful presentation on the synagogues of Prague. And it was just so much more than I anticipated. I think we all sort of afterwards, when our adult ed committee met after your presentation, Jerry, we all said that, we all said, wow, it was just so much more moving, and we didn't really anticipate what direction you were going to go in. So, and we were so, moved by it. And so we're just so glad to have you back to present again tonight. For those of you that weren't here, I think most everyone was here. I'll just give you a brief introduction to this very accomplished, Jerry Rishe earned his BA in political science from CSUN, from Cal State Northridge. And he also got his law degree from Whittier Law School. So I'm going to have to just say congratulations to both of that. He worked a lot for 32 years in the legal profession in many different capacities. He worked as an in-house counsel at First Charter Financial. He worked at the J.G. Boswell Company. He worked at St. John's Hospital and Health Center, so a variety of industries. And he also was a trial attorney at the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is now called the Department of Homeland Security. And, when he was there, he actually did some really cool stuff. He represented the United States in the enforcement of the Immigration and Nationality Act. He defended the service and department against charges in employment matters, and he was honored as Employee of the Year. So that's really quite an honor. Now he's retired, but he's not really retired. He's president of SAGE, and he's also, that's a lifelong learning organization. He's part of the Dean's Council at the Mike Curb College of Arts, Media, and Communication at CSUN, and he's a docent of the Autry National Center of the American West. And more importantly, he has been married for 45 years, which is quite an accomplishment, I would say, and has 3 children, 2 grandchildren. And we are so much looking forward to learning a little bit about how Judaism might not have been around without this guy, King Hezekiah. So thank you, Jerry. Thank you so much. We are so glad to have you here. And I turn the floor or the Zoom screen over to you.
Thank you very much, Jill. That was such a wonderful introduction. And I'm very pleased to be back because you made me feel so welcome the last time. And the Q&A was wonderful. My working with Jill and Susan and Jason at the synagogue has just been a wonderful experience. Very open, very warm, and very helpful too. You've all been exceedingly helpful to me. So I thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me back. So without further ado, King Hezekiah. Hezekiah, meaning Yahweh is my strength, was the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. He reigned for 29 years in the Jerusalem of Judah, not Israel, which is of paramount importance to our story and to the world. And why is this not progressing? Okay, here we go. Why is, I'm going to escape this for a second. This worked just before. All right. One moment. Should not. Here we go. Do you, by the way, Jill, do you see the entire map that's there? Is there anything in front of it at all?
It looks pretty good to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to be sure. So King Hezekiah had 3 profound effects through the centuries. The first is merely very important. It deals with Passover and how that holiday is celebrated today. The second is critical to the reverence for and perhaps the very existence of monotheism, and involves a serpentine staff God ordered Moses to create. The third concerns no less than the very survival of Judaism and by extension Christianity and Islam. Here's my thesis. If the Abrahamic religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have significantly affected the world for the past 2,900 plus years, none of that influence would have occurred without King Hezekiah. If you're skeptical, you should be. Let's look at the evidence. Hezekiah can be credited with renewing the tradition of the Passover pilgrimage in its full scope for the first time since the kingdom, whoops, what is wrong with this? There we go. Since the kingdom split into Israel and Judah, Hezekiah invited Judeans to take part in the most sumptuous festival seen for many generations and took that occasion to consolidate his religious reforms. That's found in 2 Chronicles. If anyone, by the way, Jill, wants the specific citations, I'm not going to give them in the context of my speech, but if someone would like them and ask you for them, I can pass them along. Here's the quotation from 2 Chronicles. A great crowd assembled at Jerusalem to keep the feast of the unleavened bread in the second month, a very great congregation. There was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for since the time of King Solomon, son of David of Israel, nothing like it had happened in Jerusalem. Focus on just that solitary aspect of Hezekiah's legacy for a moment. He was the one to celebrate Passover as it had not been celebrated for over 225 years, the estimated period between Solomon and Hezekiah. But that's not all. Hezekiah renewed absolute worship of the Israelite God after a long period in which idol worship had taken root in the city, and he destroyed what were called high places in the countryside where other rituals reigned. Here's the quotation from 2 Kings. He abolished the shrines and smashed the pillars and cut down the sacred post. He also broke into pieces the copper serpent which Moses had made, for until that time, the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. And that's in 2 Kings. This rock-hewn altar was carved out of limestone and was approximately 8 feet on each side and 5 feet high. Remains clearly reflect animal sacrifice on this quote unquote high place. But that doesn't mean he completely rid Judah of polytheistic beliefs and practices. For example, these are female Judahite pillar figurines. They're also known as, for short, JPFs. So the next time you're in a conversation with someone and someone drops a abbreviation JPF, you'll know exactly what they're talking about. There are also male and animal figures. Many theories have been suggested regarding their function and their symbolism. Some scholars theorize that they relate to fertility practices. Others propose that they represent healing practices, while still others believe that they were simply good luck charms. Archaeologists have uncovered vast quantities. These weren't just strewn here and there, a little bit, one you find and another. There were vast quantities of these broken JPFs from the century following Hezekiah. So think about that for a moment. Why should that be? It seems the reforms that were instituted by Hezekiah took time, but at least biblically speaking, it appears the reforms were initiated by Hezekiah, but it took time. Let's look at the second portion of my citation from 2 Kings. That is, that Hezekiah broke into pieces the copper serpent which Moses had made, for until that time the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. That icon is known as Nehushtan, meaning copper of serpentine shape. Nehushtan. There are arguments as to where the serpent was placed in the temple and its origin. Some historians argue that it was really made of brass and not copper. Moreover, since serpents are linked with fertility, it's also arguable that the icon had become an idol for relief from infertility. But though this is significant, everything I've told you so far is simply backstory. Apart from Nehushtan's origin, its location in the temple, and status as an idol, it's more valuable to understand its import. Recall that when the Israelites create and worship the golden calf, it's only through Moses's intervention that every man, woman, and child, except for Moses and his descendants, are not immediately killed by God's rage. Though the Israelites had not yet received the second commandment, the lesson was unmistakable. But how sacred was the second commandment, even during Moses' lifetime? The law against creating graven images and idols was not always enforced with the zeal of the story of the golden calf. For example, when the Israelites complained of not much bread in the desert, no water, and Moses' route from Egypt, he went here, there, and everywhere. He didn't take a direct line to what is now Israel. The Lord sent fiery serpents to bite them because they were complaining. Can you imagine complaining? Never mind. And many died. When the people were suitably frightened, they pled for relief. And this is what God said to Moses. It's found in Numbers chapter 21. Make thee a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked into the serpent of copper, he lived. At God's order, think about what was just ordered. At God's order, Moses formed his copper serpent and used it as an idolatrous cure for a snake bite. In other words, graven images were prohibited unless permitted by the order of God. The second commandment is so sacred, God threatens to immediately destroy the Israelites, man, woman, and child, when they create and worship the golden calf and start over with only Moses and his descendants. Only when Moses challenges God to repent of this evil does God spare the Israelites from divine genocide. Quote, and the Lord repented of the evil which he said he would do unto his people, unquote. Ponder that notion for a moment. The book of Exodus depicts God's plan as evil, but God still had his divine reprisal. So Moses carried out a bloody purge, slaughtering about 3,000 men by the sword, including every man his brother. It's found in Exodus chapter 32. Now, this was no mere mass carnage. It was divine vengeance for violation of the second commandment, Exodus 20. Quote, you shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself any graven image, unquote. It was this copper serpent that Hezekiah shattered. If the story is true, then the people of Israel had not only been using it as an idolatrous cure for snakebite, but they had also been offering sacrifices to it since the time of Moses, a period of over 700 years. Hezekiah's breaking Moses' staff into pieces may be seen as the reintegration of monotheism into Judaism, and through Judaism as an Abrahamic religion to Christianity and to Islam. Everything I've just gone over, by the way, though, is all merely prelude to Hezekiah's next triumph, his rescue of Judaism from annihilation. Military events, even ones seemingly insignificant when they occur, can have unforeseen consequences not apparent when they happen, and occasionally not for centuries. Solomon is described as the king of the united monarchy. After Solomon's death, revolts broke out over who should be king. The kingdom of Israel split. We'll get to that map. There we are. Israel became the northern kingdom and Judah the southern kingdom. The capitals were Samaria in Israel and Jerusalem in Judah. Hezekiah ruled Judah, not Israel, Judah, from Jerusalem between roughly 715 to 687 BCE. It was a very uncertain time. 7 years before Hezekiah became Jerusalem's ruler, the bordering kingdom of Israel, the larger and richer part of David's kingdom, met disaster when Assyrian king Sargon II captured Samaria and carried off thousands of survivors in 722 BCE. The Assyrians' next campaign against the kingdom of Judah could easily have extinguished Judaism forever. The questions posed for those in Jerusalem were profound. Did the kingdom of Israel's defeat mean the God of Moses and David, the same God still worshipped in the temple Solomon built in Jerusalem, could no longer defend his people? Or had God punished the Israelites and their rulers for disobedience to his will as revealed in sacred scriptures and the words of his prophets? The questions were also urgent, since no one wanted to believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would or could not defend his people. If one took the view that the Israelites were being punished for disobedience to God's will, God had used the mightiest empire of the age to punish his people. Though the Assyrians worshipped other gods, did not pretend to honor God's commandments, and were seemingly being rewarded for not believing. Either that, or the Assyrian gods were mightier than Yahweh. Rejecting the last reason as impossible, the theory still ran counter to the common sense notion that gods defended their worshipers. Victory and defeat 2,700 plus years ago also reflected the power of rival deities as well as the strength of human armies. It logically followed that when the Assyrians began their imperial expansion, each new victory transformed religious loyalties in peoples that they conquered. That response was ultimately changed by the Judeans' unique reaction. Hezekiah did embrace the view of religious reformers who set out to purify worship of Yahweh by consecrating it and concentrating it in the temple. But he also consulted with inspired prophets, such as Isaiah. Hezekiah did something else, though. He appealed to Egypt. Hard to believe, right? Israel, Judah, appealing to Egypt to be an ally. But he did. He appealed to Egypt to halt the Assyrian expansion, and Isaiah, the prophet, was infuriated, mocking Hezekiah's pragmatic approach. And this is what Isaiah said. Ha! He actually said that. Ha! Those who go down to Egypt for help and rely upon horses, they have put their trust in an abundance of chariots, in vast numbers of riders, and they have not turned to the Holy One of Israel. They have not sought the Lord. You can find that in Isaiah chapter 31. Isaiah claimed the Assyrian conquests were no more than a sign to resume worship of God with a full heart, and any attempt to rely on earthly military help alone would be doomed to failure. But Hezekiah didn't only rely on earthly allies or supernatural shelter. He fortified Jerusalem's walls and expanded his borders, pushing the Philistines to Gaza. You can find that in 2 Kings. And when the Assyrians defeated the Egyptians, Hezekiah relented. He had no choice. He came to terms with the victors, that is the Assyrians, and paid to remain on his throne. It's kind of a protection racket, basically, that the Assyrians were running. They said, we'll leave you alone if you pay us. In what has been described as one of the largest tribute payments ever received by any monarch. So what did he pay? Well, we actually have a fair idea of what he paid. It's described in the Bible. 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, all of which may have been taken from the temple. You can find this in 2 Kings chapter 18. Now, I have to do a little figuring, but I've done that for you. A talent is approximately 75 pounds. So that comes to 22,500 pounds of silver and 2,250 pounds of gold. Let's put that into perspective to today. I looked up this morning the value of the spot price of gold and silver, the per ounce. I just did some multiplication. That was $7,894,800 in silver and $65,044,800 in gold, a protection payoff to be left alone of $72,939,600. That's today. Actually, a week or so ago, I checked, it was actually a little more. But Hezekiah retained his throne, and Jerusalem and Judaism survived. Some biblical writers present Hezekiah's reformation as motivated solely by piety and righteousness. It's possible, but consider that it also benefited him sociopolitically, strategically, and crucially, economically, even though it cost him that $72 million plus. Hezekiah's tribute to the Assyrians permitted him to remain in control of the Judean economy and direct the flow of tithes and taxes to the temple in Jerusalem. Regardless, when the 10 tribes of Israel were defeated in Israel, not Judah, they became exiles and soon lost their separate identity, as we all know. They accepted common sense views about the limits of divine power, abandoned the worship of Yahweh, who had failed to protect them, and became the 10 lost tribes of history. Judah would have met the same fate if the Assyrians later captured Jerusalem in 701 BCE and treated it like Israel and other conquered territories. If so, it can be reasonably argued that Judaism would have disappeared from the face of the earth, and the two daughter religions of Christianity and Islam would not have developed. Our world today, for better or worse, would be profoundly different in ways we cannot even imagine. The biblical version of the Assyrian campaign against Judah and Jerusalem appears in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and the book of Isaiah. All three accounts agree in all of the essentials and even use some of the same language. They depict the Assyrian failure to take the holy city and how God intervened. Sennacherib's scribes write of their great victory. The biblical stories are a bit different. They have shaped Jewish beliefs of what happened before the walls of Jerusalem, and those views made it possible to believe that the God of Moses was omnipotent, shielding his believers from the world's mightiest monarch. This one episode, as understood by the pious in Jerusalem, made monotheism credible as never before, allowing the Jewish religion to survive and thrive in the age of the Assyrian conquests. To survivors of the Assyrian siege, one moment. Excuse me. Only God's universal power could explain Jerusalem's survival. For Jews, leaving their ancestral religion and accepting gods of alien, imperial rulers whose power was exhibited by only war was unacceptable. And it was a cowardly response. As a result, Jewish monotheism grew and exerted a wider influence. Think of the audacity. There's a technical term that historians use. It's called chutzpah. The people of this small and vulnerable kingdom of Judah uniquely had the temerity to believe that their God, Yahweh, was the only true God. The Assyrian withdrawal from the walls of Jerusalem in 701 BCE confirmed this belief, proving God's universal power to pious and eager believers. So how did Hezekiah save Jerusalem? Here is what's reported. The Rishe, who was the chief of the Assyrian royal staff, he stood before the city and cried out in the Jews' language. Here's the quotation from 2 Kings. Hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying the Lord will deliver us. Did any of the gods of other nations deliver his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Now, little aside here, it's reported that the Rishe spoke in Hebrew. Now that's significant. Why? The Judean officials begged the Rishe to switch to Aramaic. That's in 2 Kings. Why did they do that? Well, at the time, Aramaic, not Hebrew, was used for regional diplomacy and commerce, and those on the wall wouldn't know it. Only those who were leading Judah at the time would know that language. They didn't want everybody else to know what was going on, at least not from the Assyrians. They wanted to monitor what was being said to their own people. So here's the quotation from 2 Kings. Speak not with us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people that are on the wall. By the way, the Judeans, as you may know, did not surrender. Here's what's reported in 2 Kings. The angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt in Nineveh. As I said, that's in 2 Kings. So how did all those soldiers die overnight? Was it the angel of death? A divine pestilence? A Pesach plague? The biblical passages that I've read, and which I'll refer to, relate a miraculous rescue, proving Hezekiah and Isaiah were right to rely on God's power and protection. More than that, it proved God's power over the mightiest ruler of the age. As an aside, by the way, 185,000 dead must be vastly exaggerated. No ancient army came close to that size. But regardless, especially, by the way, one in the minor area of Jerusalem. But there was no need now, of course, for Judah to be second to any nation. But think about this. If that were really true, then why would Hezekiah's son and successor, Manasseh, remain in tribute to the Assyrians all through his reign? He set up what was called a carved image in the house of God, found in 2 Chronicles, and allowed other heathen forms of worship that were evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet God allowed Manasseh to remain in power for 55 years. Was he being divinely rewarded for his apparent apostasy? Was the God of Judah and Israel not as powerful as represented? Was heavenly retribution simply waiting for the arrival of the Babylonians later? Or was it simply that by paying tribute to Assyria and carefully refraining from rebellion, Hezekiah and his heirs and successors were able to maintain the little kingdom of Judah for more than another century? Or was there another viable reason, other than belief in God's power, as to how Hezekiah planned to defend Jerusalem against Assyrian attack? I believe that there is. And you have to look at the context and the archaeology to find out. Unless one believes that no analysis is allowed, we can return to the Bible for hints of what may have happened. We can also pursue other reasons why Sennacherib may have ended his siege against the strongly fortified city of Jerusalem. So what might have happened besides divine intervention? What did Hezekiah do, and why did he do it? What tactical strategic decisions did he make in anticipating the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem? According to 2 Chronicles, in chapter 32, here's the quotation. When Hezekiah saw Sennacherib was come, and he proposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes and mighty men to stop the waters of the fountains, which were without the city. And they did help him. So there was gathered much people together who stopped all the fountains and brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, why should the king of Assyria come and find much water? Some archaeologists believe Hezekiah ordered a tunnel built under the city of David in Jerusalem that still to this day carries water from the Gihon spring, the city's only natural water source, to the pool of Shiloah. Others think the tunnel is much older, and still others that Hezekiah improved that older channel. But regardless of who had dug the tunnel originally, it does exist. You can walk it today. It's over 583 yards long, and it's carved out of bedrock. What if Hezekiah did order the only water source in the city closed to deny it to the enemy? Would the Assyrians have been forced to drink any standing water they might find and expose themselves to infections? Look, we know today that there are roughly 30 distinct infections caused by contaminated water, including botulism, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. Cholera can exhibit symptoms in only 2 hours, and left untreated, even in healthy people, can be fatal in only hours. The problem with the polluted water theory that I've just presented to you is that the Jordan River is only about 20 miles from Jerusalem. It's logical to think that the Assyrians were aware of that ample water supply, but here's the other side of it. Did too many Assyrians drink too quickly from the polluted source? We don't know. Another theory is that the Assyrians died by bubonic plague carried by mice. We simply don't know. The biblical story of Hezekiah, his princes and mighty men anticipating how hard it would be to find enough potable water in Jerusalem's dry regions, appears sensible. The strategy to protect their city by denying a fresh water supply to an enemy was strategically sound, tactically viable, and ultimately available. In this light, Hezekiah's decision may have had more to do with the Assyrian retreat than the miracle recorded in the Bible, unless, of course, one believes all Hezekiah's actions in saving Jerusalem were divinely inspired or directed. One can argue Hezekiah was divinely inspired, a gifted tactician, or simply didn't let his ego get in the way of listening to sound advice. Whatever the reason or reasons for his actions, his success preserved Jerusalem and Judaism. But why else might Sennacherib and the Rabshakeh not press the siege of Jerusalem to a conclusion? Well, it may not have been very important to them. Also, issues in Assyria may have forced his return. Judah was a marginal player in the ancient Near East. It was poorer and weaker than Sennacherib's other enemies. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, had already been punished. During Sennacherib's campaign, he occupied many walled places in Judah and forced Hezekiah to shut himself up in Jerusalem, as Sennacherib's scribes wrote, like a bird in a cage. But Sennacherib's victory over the kingdom of Judah was incomplete because of his failure to destroy Jerusalem. Didn't seem to matter, though, when Hezekiah's son Manasseh permitted an idol in the temple, but when the Assyrian Empire collapsed, Josiah, Manasseh's grandson, rejected the cults his grandfather allowed in Jerusalem, and Judaism survived again. While the temple, by the way, was being repaired in 622 BCE during Josiah's reign, 79 years after the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, 64 years after Hezekiah's death, and 36 years before the Babylonian exile and captivity, the high priest found a book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. He found reference to this in 2 Chronicles. The name of that book is Deuteronomy. It derives from the Greek translation of Hebrew, meaning second or repeated law. The name itself is fitting, since Deuteronomy repeats law and history known from prior parts of the Pentateuch. Dating and trying to establish Deuteronomy's author are interesting intellectual exercises, but Deuteronomy's significance lies elsewhere. That is, it became the basis for a vigorous effort to reform religious practices and bring them into accord with God's will as newly discovered. When King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the primary successor to Sennacherib of Assyria, destroyed the kingdom of Judah in 586 BCE, razed the temple and carried Jews to his capital in Babylon 115 years after Hezekiah had saved Jerusalem, the pious had to determine why God allowed such a disaster. But by then, the idea that God governed the world had found its rebirth as a direct result of Hezekiah's actions and was so firmly recognized that forsaking Yahweh by that time was unthinkable. Instead, long-standing prophetic denunciations of the sins of the Jews made it obvious the Babylonian exile was God's punishment for the failure of Yahweh's rulers and people to observe his commandments. It didn't matter if God used the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or other means to punish. The argument was accepted that no matter how passionate their effort at religious reform had been, even the most pious fell short of obeying God's commandments. Similar arguments, as you well know, have been used to explain why God permitted the Holocaust. In any event, what were the Jews to do? There was no temple. It had been destroyed. Devastation by the Babylonians could have ended Jewish history. Instead, the exiled people of Judah flourished in Babylon and reorganized their scriptures to create an unambiguously monotheistic congregational religion, you might recognize this, independent of place and emancipated from the sites of Solomon's devastated temple in Jerusalem. Moreover, the revised Jewish faith, tempered in exile, gave birth to Christianity and Islam, and it retains its own following around the world, especially, of course, in Israel. The Babylonian captivity ended in 538 BCE, 48 years after it began, and only 37 years after the completion of the Ishtar Gate, part of a grand walled way leading into Babylon. I show you this because Jews during the captivity in Babylon would have seen this very entrance. You can see the same gate today in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. When the exile ended, some Jews didn't return to Israel and remained in Babylon and elsewhere in the ancient world. After the Second Temple's destruction in 70 CE and the later Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136, the majority of Jews began living outside of Israel in the diaspora, which is a Greek word meaning scattered. They reinvented themselves so they could remain Jews in far-flung communities across the ancient world. Their Judaism was stripped of priestly and temple-based rituals and designed for export to the diaspora. Judaism ceased being local and became a guide to life in diverse settings anywhere in the world. These acts of self-invention and change created rabbinical Judaism, and rabbinical Judaism enabled Jews to survive over the last 2,600 plus years. If Hezekiah had failed to defend Jerusalem in 701 BCE, none of that may have happened. 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah are filled with references to Hezekiah. But the question remains, does archaeology say anything about King Hezekiah's existence? The answer is yes, and there have been two discoveries. About 1880, a rock-hewn inscription in ancient Hebrew was found in the Shalom Gihon tunnel. There's no date on the engraving, and it does not name Hezekiah, but it does describe two teams beginning at opposite ends of the waterway who dug toward each other and met. Most scholars accept the biblical account as the most likely version. Moreover, radiometric dating, a technique used to date materials such as rocks or carbon, shows the tunnel was excavated about 700 years BCE, exactly the time of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, confirming that it can be safely attributed to King Hezekiah. In 1890, a vandal entered the tunnel and cut the inscription out of the rock, and was later, unfortunately, found. It was later found in several pieces. Turkish officials, the Ottomans were in control of Palestine then, recovered the pieces and placed them in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, where they remain today. On March 11th, 2022, the Times of Israel reported Turkey had agreed to return the Shalom inscription. The next day or two, the Daily Sabah of Istanbul cited diplomatic sources denying the Israeli account, and the inscription remains in Istanbul today. So why is that inscription significant to Israel? Physical evidence for Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael and Judea in the First Temple period is relatively scarce. Most promising archaeological sites are inaccessible for political or religious reasons, or because they're under densely inhabited areas. The Temple Mount, the elevated plaza above the Western Wall, was the site of both of Judaism's ancient temples and is the third holiest in Islam after Mecca and Medina. It was probably ruined for archaeological research by extensive excavations, building a large mosque beneath it, and removing tons of debris. But there's ample evidence for the inscription's return to its original home in Israel, especially since there's no question where it came from, to whose culture it belongs, or that it was taken from an immovable monument. Moreover, for the Turks, it has little, if any, significance other than embodying a time when the Ottoman Empire ruled the area. Nor is it notably beautiful, unless you enjoy ancient Paleo-Hebrew lettering. There's another reason for attempts to discredit Old Testament accounts and Jewish tradition. These efforts received impetus and political import when the PLO was created by the Oslo Accords in 1993, with Oslo II in 1995. Sheikh Ikrima Sabri, the Mufti of Jerusalem from 1994 to 2006, declared more than once that there was no evidence of a Jewish presence in Jerusalem in ancient times. And Palestinian academics still publish works calling the notion that the Jews were there a myth. The second discovery that I referenced earlier occurred in 2015. Hebrew University of Jerusalem announced the first seal impression of a Judahite king ever found by archaeologists in Jerusalem. It says, wait for it, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz of Judah. It shows a two-winged sun with wings turned down, flanked by two Ankh symbols denoting life. Known as a bula, it's the size of a human thumbnail and pressed in mud by the king's personal seal on papyrus or parchment. Prior to this discovery, all other seal imprints were veiled in vagueness because their origin was unknown. Now it's clear the two previously known identical seal impressions were authentic and came from the same seal. Eilat Mazar, director of excavations at the City of David Summit, said, the seal of the king was so important, it could have been a matter of life or death. So it's hard to believe anyone else had, had permission to use the seal. The seal that you just saw, the hand creating that seal, was likely Hezekiah's. So how do we reconcile our two stories of the kingdom of Judah's triumph and downfall? It appears paradoxical to argue that Sennacherib's withdrawal from Jerusalem supports Isaiah's prophecy and Hezekiah's religious policy, while Nebuchadnezzar's success in completing what Sennacherib only threatened instead of undermining that faith, confirmed Jewish monotheism and let Christianity and Islam ascend. Victory and defeat led to the same Jewish conclusion. Hezekiah's military strategy, using the Gihon Spring Shalom Tunnel, may, at least in part, have resulted in Sennacherib's withdrawal. If so, his decisions were critical for the emergence of monotheism in the tiny kingdom of Judah, especially since the kingdom of Israel had been defeated and its people dispersed. Conversely, Nebuchadnezzar's success in carrying out what Sennacherib had only threatened, Jerusalem's destruction, and with it the two remaining tribes of Israel, that is Judah and Benjamin, instead of discrediting monotheism, confirmed it for the Jews. To the pious, the answer was clear. Hezekiah and his followers were saved because they were righteous in the eyes of the Lord, and the temple's destruction and expulsion of the Jewish people was the result of irreverent and sinful acts. No matter the result, win or lose, the conclusion to the Jews was an affirmance of monotheism. Is that a paradox? It's for you to decide. So what can we objectively conclude? What we can objectively conclude is that Hezekiah was the right man at the right place at the right time. He paid tribute, but Judaism survived. He reportedly blocked Gihon Spring's flow, and unless the Assyrians died by divine decree or an overnight plague, but for Hezekiah's actions, the Jews of Jerusalem and Judah would likely have vanished from the face of the earth, as did the 10 tribes of the kingdom of Israel before them. If that had happened, what would our lives, our spiritual selves, and our world, for better or worse, look like today? Thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you, Jerry. That was fascinating, don't you think, guys think? It was wonderful. I am going to stop the record, and I'm going to